The forest had its own kind of silence, not the absence of sound, but the kind that let you hear your own heart beat if you stood still long enough. Caleb Morgan had learned to read that silence over the years, to feel when it shifted. And today, it had shifted. He spotted it mid-morning, just beyond the ridge where the sun hadn't yet burned off the frost. A towering ponderosa pine, nearly 3 feet across at the base, leaned slightly west as if tired from standing too long. But it wasn't the lean that caught Caleb's eye, it was the bulge. The lump jutted out from the trunk like a swollen shoulder, covered in cracked bark that wept slow trails of dark, sticky sap. It was too uniform, too rounded. He stepped closer, boots crunching soft needles until he could smell it. Not pine, not rot. Something off. Behind him, Axel let out a low whine. Caleb turned. The old German shepherd mix stood rigid, amber eyes locked on the tree, hackles raised. And then, for the first time in more than a decade, he barked. One sharp, thunderous bark that split the quiet and made the birds burst from the nearby branches. Caleb froze. Axel didn't bark without cause. The dog had walked through storms, stared down bears, and slept through a thunderous rockslide last spring. But this tree, this lump? The second bark came faster, urgent, not fear, not aggression, a warning. "Easy, boy," Caleb murmured, hand drifting to the old hatchet looped through his belt. "Ain't nothing but a bad tree." But the hairs on his arms stood on end. Axel took 2 steps back, positioning himself between Caleb and the trail behind them, still staring at the lump. That's when Caleb knew. This wasn't natural. It wasn't a burl or a lightning scar. It wasn't disease. It was a secret. He gripped the handle of the hatchet with fingers gone stiff from age and instinct. His gut twisted the way it had 20 years ago in Kandahar, when the ground looked too smooth and the air too quiet. He'd trusted that feeling then. It had saved his unit. Now, standing in a forest that had been his only companion for over a decade, he felt it again. His hand trembled once, then steadied. He swung. The hatchet struck with a dull thunk, not the crisp split of healthy pine. Sap oozed dark and thick, staining the bark like coagulated blood. The smell that hit him was wrong. Old, organic, like something sealed in a root cellar too long. Axel growled low in his throat. Caleb stepped back and wiped his blade on his pant leg, breath short. He hesitated, then drove the hatchet in again. Deeper. The wood gave way, softer than it should have been. And then it wasn't wood anymore. The third swing revealed a flicker of color beneath the pulp. He paused. It was fabric, old brown stiff. He reached in carefully with 2 fingers and tugged. A corner peeled back like old leather, revealing stitching. A seam. Not bark, not root, a jacket. He staggered back. "No," he whispered. Axel barked again, sharp and guttural. This time it wasn't just warning, it was command. "Step back. Stay alert." The air around them had changed, charged like the moment before lightning hits a ridgeline. Caleb crouched low, years of training crawling back over muscle memory he thought he'd buried. He scanned the surrounding woods. Nothing moved. Still he felt it. The same heaviness in the chest, the press behind the eyes. Someone had died here, not fallen, not gotten lost. Buried, in the trunk of a tree. He didn't need a coroner. He didn't need a badge. He'd seen enough in his lifetime to know when a death wasn't accidental. Caleb looked at Axel, who stared up at him with something close to sorrow in his eyes. The dog wasn't just reacting to the smell. He knew, and Caleb trusted him more than he'd ever trusted another soul. He looked back at the tree. The sap had begun to pool at the base now, like the thing inside was bleeding. And maybe it was. A voice from the past echoed in his mind. "The forest remembers, Caleb. She don't forget. She just waits until someone cares enough to listen. He hadn't cared for a long time. But now, something had changed. "I need the big axe," he said aloud, more to himself than Axel. The dog gave one small huff, then turned down the trail, already heading back toward the cabin like he understood the plan. Caleb followed slowly, glancing back once. That tree hadn't grown around a storm. It had grown around a secret, and it was time to cut it loose. Caleb Morgan never liked the term "off the grid." It sounded trendy, like a weekend experiment by city folks playing survivalist. What he chose wasn't about escaping Wi-Fi or detoxing from emails. It was exile, self-imposed, absolute. 11 years earlier, he'd turned the key on a world that had taken everything from him. He'd once worn the olive-green uniform of a federal forestry officer with pride, the kind who knew how to read clouds before they spoke thunder, who could name every moss and pine needle underfoot. He met his wife, Claire, in a fire zone outside Missoula. She was Red Cross. He was boots on the ground. They'd raised their daughter, Ellie, under the shadow of sequoias and red maples, camping more nights than they spent indoors. Then, one fall evening, a truck veered off a cliff road in Yosemite. The report said, brake failure. The autopsy said, blunt trauma. The file was closed fast, too fast. Caleb had questions, the kind that made people uncomfortable, the kind that got calls ignored, the kind that made a man stop asking. He left the service a month later, sold the house, gave away the badge, and with a silent German shepherd by his side, a dog he barely knew, he vanished into the timberline of eastern Oregon. Axel had been an afterthought, an injured K9 brought back from Afghanistan with shrapnel near his spine and PTSD in his eyes. No handler wanted him. Too volatile, too quiet. Caleb understood that look. They lived alone for years in a log cabin Caleb built from scratch with his own hands. No electricity but a generator, no neighbors within 5 miles, just the wind through pine, the creek running cold, and 2 souls learning how to trust silence. Axel healed slowly. He flinched at loud sounds, slept light, watched the tree line with the intensity of a sniper. But he never barked. Not once. Not until yesterday. Caleb sat at the edge of the porch that morning, steaming tin mug in hand, eyes locked on the treetops beyond the ridge. He couldn't stop thinking about that lump, the fabric, the unnatural softness under the bark, and Axel's reaction. He looked down at the old dog lying near the woodpile, head resting on crossed paws, but eyes wide open, tracking him. "You knew," Caleb said quietly, before I even swung. Axel blinked, slow and deliberate. "What did you smell, huh?" What was in there? Caleb didn't expect a response, but the dog sat up, stiff from age and memory. Then, with a grunt, walked toward the trailhead again, pausing only once to look back. Caleb followed. They walked in silence, boots and paws crunching needles and soil until they reached the clearing. The tree stood unchanged at first glance. But now, Caleb saw what he'd missed before. The soil around the base had been disturbed, not recently, but not decades ago either. The moss coverage was uneven, subtle, like someone had tried to cover up work done fast and without precision. He knelt and touched the earth. Who would bury something in a tree? He murmured. Axel stood beside him, ears twitching, gaze fixed at the treetop now, as if the tree were more than wood and roots, as if it remembered. Caleb rose slowly, back cracking. He wasn't a lawman anymore, but he still knew how to document a scene. He walked back to the cabin, pulled an old field bag from the closet, the kind he hadn't touched in a decade. Inside were measuring tape, gloves, a weatherproof notepad, and a rusting Canon DSLR camera with half a charge left. Back at the site, he documented the scar where he'd struck, took close-ups of the fabric, measured the circumference of the lump, jotted a few notes. He was halfway through a second pass when Axel suddenly let out a low, sharp growl, not toward the tree this time, but the opposite direction. Caleb turned. Footprints. Faint, not new, but not old enough to have been his either. He followed them a few paces, squinting against the morning sun. The tracks veered sharply into the underbrush, heading towards the ravine that bordered the western edge of his property. And then they disappeared. Who had been here? And when? A sick thought crept in. What if whoever left something in that tree had come back? What if they'd realized someone had found it? Caleb looked around. Everything seemed still, but he felt the woods watching him now. Back at the cabin, he checked the locks on the shed and the storage room. Old habits died hard. He found himself reaching for the sidearm he hadn't used in years. Still in its case, still oiled, still loaded. He sat on the steps again, Axel now curled tight at his feet, finally resting. And Caleb whispered, "This wasn't just some old corpse, was it?" There was something about the smell inside that tree, the texture of the cloth, the careful placement. It wasn't rushed like someone hiding panic. It was chosen, intentional, clean, a burial or a warning. He hadn't spoken to another human being in almost 3 months, hadn't driven his truck off the property in half a year, but now every instinct told him this was no accident of nature. This was a message someone wanted hidden. And maybe, just maybe, that someone didn't want it hidden anymore. As the wind shifted through the trees and the clouds rolled in over the mountains, Caleb felt it settle into his bones. The forest had given him silence. Now it was asking him to break it. Caleb returned to the clearing with a canvas satchel slung across his shoulder. The straps were frayed and sun-faded, but the contents were carefully chosen. A small entrenching tool, latex gloves, a headlamp with backup batteries, an old Canon camera that had survived a wildfire, and a black notebook with his handwriting from a life he no longer spoke of. Axel padded beside him, tense, eyes sharp. The dog had sensed it before Caleb ever did. Whatever was in that tree had disturbed more than bark and soil. It had disturbed memory. The sun had dipped low behind the ridge, but Caleb didn't wait for morning. He strapped on the headlamp, flicked the beam to high, and stared at the scar on the side of the tree right where he'd struck it with the axe. The bark was darker now, slightly caved in around the edges. He knelt down, brushing away loose fibers, and started digging. The blade of the entrenching tool scraped against something not quite wood. Caleb paused, switched to gloved hands, dug slowly, peeling back layers of resin-coated material, sticky and fibrous like it had been cooked into the tree over decades. Axel gave a low growl behind him. "Easy, boy," Caleb whispered. That was when he felt it. Soft fabric. He blinked and leaned in closer. The lump wasn't just a growth, it was hiding something inside, encased in tree pitch, hardened over time like ancient amber. Caleb pulled gently. The outer shell cracked, and a section peeled free with a wet snap. Axel backed up, teeth showing, then barked once sharp, urgent warning. A waft of chemical rot hit Caleb square in the face. He turned his head, gagged once, then steadied himself and looked back. Now exposed in the beam of his headlamp was a metal zipper, tarnished, partially eaten by time, but unmistakable. Beneath the zipper, fabric, canvas, and below that, a dark patch of something organic. He reached forward, fingers trembling not from cold but instinct, and pressed against the material. It gave. Flesh, not animal, not recent. Caleb stood up too fast, staggered backward, nearly tripping over a root. Axel came to his side instantly, body pressed against Caleb's shin, a silent pillar. Caleb stared down at the opening, heart pounding. He'd seen decomposed remains before, Forests kept their share of tragedy. Hunters, missing hikers, storm casualties, even suicides tucked deep in the valleys. But this wasn't a body lost to nature. This was a body hidden from it. He took a few breaths and forced his hand steady enough to lift the camera. He snapped several photos, adjusting the focus manually, documenting the exposed fabric, the zipper, the strange way the tree had grown around it. A burial not in the ground, but in the flesh of the forest itself. He dropped to one knee again and began clearing more of the hardened resin. A piece of the canvas loosened, revealing what looked like the curve of a shoulder. There were remnants of stitching military style, faded olive green, like an old flight suit, or tactical gear. His fingers brushed metal again. A dog tag, number, a buckle, a harness strap, and then he saw it, just barely peeking through the resin skin. No longer skin, really, but the unmistakable texture of what used to be it. Grey, marbled, stretched like old leather. Caleb's stomach turned. He backed away again, pulling the gloves off as if the contamination could seep through. Axel stood between Caleb and the tree now, not barking, just holding his ground, tail stiff, body frozen. Not afraid. Alert. You were right, Caleb said hoarsely. This wasn't a guess. You knew the dog flicked an ear but didn't move. Caleb wiped sweat from his brow and looked up at the night sky bleeding in over the treetops. He didn't want to believe what he already knew. That body inside that tree had been there for decades. Someone had gone through incredible effort to entomb it. Not dump it, not hide it in a cave or a lake. Number. They chose a tree, which meant they wanted it found only under one condition. Never. Caleb sat on a nearby stump, hand still shaking slightly. He wasn't sure which disturbed him more, the fact that someone had killed and buried a human being inside a tree, or that the only reason he'd found it was because an old, broken war dog had decided it was time. And maybe, just maybe, that dog had waited all this time to tell him. The sun hadn't quite crested the ridge when Caleb returned to the clearing with a thermos of stale black coffee and a flat-edged chisel. The air was thin and cold, the kind of mountain morning that made your breath visible but your thoughts clearer. Axel trotted ahead, already circling the tree as if guarding it. Caleb knelt beside the wound in the trunk. Resin had hardened overnight, sealing parts of the opening again, like the forest itself was trying to take back its secret. But Caleb wasn't leaving it alone now. He worked slowly, careful not to damage anything beneath the bark. His gloves were tacky with sap, his back ached, but his hands remained steady. More of the canvas peeled away under his efforts, revealing fragments of what looked like a uniform shirt, fused with organic remains. Beneath it, something rectangular jutted slightly against the cloth. Caleb paused. He cleared the space carefully, and then pried it loose. It was a leather wallet, a mess, water-damaged and stiff, but intact. He held his breath and opened it. The first thing he saw was a faded photo creased, nearly stuck to the inner lining. A man in his 30s, square-jawed, wearing a blue windbreaker and a half-smile. Behind him stood an open vista of pine trees, likely somewhere not far from here. Caleb turned to the ID tucked in the next sleeve. Stephen Walsh. The name hit like a slap. Under it, the issue date, January 1988. Caleb sat back on his heels, heart pounding. He'd been in forestry long enough to recognize the name. Stephen Walsh was a geotechnical surveyor. He remembered seeing it on an internal memo back in the early 90s. There'd been a quiet case, a disappearance, no foul play suspected, file closed due to lack of leads, but no one had looked inside a tree. He flipped through the rest of the wallet. Credit cards, all long expired, a folded gas receipt from Missoula, and tucked deep in a hidden flap, a small waterproof pouch. Inside was a thin, curled piece of paper, yellowed and brittle, but legible. It was a hand-drawn map. Caleb laid it flat on a clean patch of canvas and weighed it down with a stone. The map didn't show roads. It showed something else, an overland route, drawn in pencil and marked with odd notations. Ridge drift, fault vein, black line, and finally a circled X near what looked like a bend in a creek. Caleb squinted, recognizing the general layout. This wasn't a recreational trail or some hiker's doodle. It was a survey map, maybe even a mineral prospecting plan. But there were no GPS coordinates, no reference points beyond the natural terrain. And most importantly, it charted a section of forest that didn't exist on any public record. He folded the map and put it back in the wallet, then looked down at Axel. The dog had settled by the edge of the clearing, ears forward, watching Caleb closely. Not anxiously, attentively. "You knew it wasn't over," Caleb said softly. "That's why you brought me here again." Axel didn't move. Caleb sat still for a long moment, trying to piece it together. Stephen Walsh had come out here to survey something. He'd found something, or someone, that didn't want to be found. And whoever buried him inside the tree hadn't just wanted him dead. They'd wanted him erased, and nearly succeeded. Until Axel. Caleb stood slowly and packed the wallet and map into a weatherproof pouch. He glanced back once more at the gash in the tree. "Stephen Walsh," he murmured. "You've waited long enough." That name would need to be reported, quietly, carefully, but not just yet. Not before Caleb followed the path on the map, not before he understood what Stephen saw. Axel rose without being called, as if he'd been waiting for that decision. As they walked back toward the cabin, Caleb tightened his grip on the pouch. He didn't know what they'd find, but he knew something deeper than logic was pulling them forward now, and this time he wouldn't look away. The next morning, frost clung to the edges of the pine needles like shards of glass. Caleb moved through the forest with slow, deliberate steps. He had the map in a chest pocket, a digital camera around his neck, and an old ranger's field knife strapped to his hip knot for show, but because he could feel it in his gut now. Someone had gone to great lengths to bury the truth, and people like that didn't stop just because 30 years had passed. Axel walked ahead, but kept looking back more than usual. His ears flicked at sounds Caleb couldn't hear, muscles taut with the tension of instinct. They were 2 hours out when it happened. Axel froze mid-step. Then a low, guttural growl vibrated from his chest, deep and warning. His body lowered slightly, tail still, nose lifted to the wind. He wasn't growling at an animal. Caleb dropped behind a tree, eyes scanning the dense timberline behind them. Nothing. But Axel's reaction was no mistake. Caleb had seen that posture before, during recon patrols with K9’s back in his forestry service days. That kind of growl only came when a dog picked up on something human, something close, and something wrong. "Stay with me," Caleb whispered. He backed off the trail and looped around the hillside, following an old game trail that barely existed anymore. It led down to a ravine where the ruins of an old fire lookout station still stood. Long abandoned, mostly forgotten, which made it the perfect place to hide files no one wanted found. Caleb had been here decades ago, back when he first started as a ranger. The foundation still held, and though most of the roof had collapsed, a lower storage room caved in on one side was still accessible through a crawl space behind a cluster of fallen logs. He left Axel to stand guard at the tree line and squeezed himself into the crawl space. Inside, the air was stale, damp with rot and mold, but it smelled like paper. Real paper, the kind that never made it into the state archives. He found the old filing cabinet half buried in dirt and leaves. It groaned when he forced it open. Inside, A mess of mildewed ranger logs, surveys, incident reports. Some were too far gone to read, but others were still legible. He looked for anything dated around 1988. After 20 minutes, he found an incident report labeled June 17th, 1988, unauthorized geological activity. No names, no photos, just vague language. Surveying activity halted by unidentified event, ranger escort terminated, report closed. Then he noticed it. 2 pages were missing, torn clean from the binding, and at the bottom, a faint notation. Forwarded to Central Forestry Records, Helena. But Caleb knew Helena's archives. If it had been forwarded, it wasn't made public. He kept digging and found an old manila envelope marked Walsh. His pulse quickened. Inside were notes, terrain diagrams, and one faded photograph, Stephen Walsh, standing next to a pine tree with a red surveyor's flag in the background. A blue windbreaker. Same man from the wallet photo. But here's what chilled Caleb. That photo wasn't dated, and it had "Do not duplicate" stamped in red across the bottom corner. Why hide a photo of a missing man? Axel barked sharply from outside. Not a growl, a bark. Short, commanding, alert. Caleb grabbed everything he could, stuffed it into his backpack, and scrambled out of the crawl space. Axel was facing the ridge, tail rigid, barking toward a patch of brush where the light didn't quite reach. Caleb followed his line of sight. Movement. A silhouette. Gone. Whoever it was had been watching. Not hunting. Watching. Caleb turned back toward Axel. "We're not alone out here." They made their way home with extra caution, every branch snap and rustle, sending tension up Caleb's spine. He didn't stop once. Not until the cabin came into view and the front gate clicked shut behind them. Inside, Caleb laid everything out on the table. He snapped photos of the torn documents, the photo of Stephen, the red stamped markings. His phone didn't have service this far out, but he knew a trailhead up the mountain with weak signal. He'd send backups from there later. He stared at the photo. Stephen had stood by a tree that looked eerily familiar. Same strange bulge near the base. Caleb blinked. Could it be? The body wasn't just buried in a tree, it was the tree Stephen flagged in his original survey. Someone must have turned that exact spot into his grave-using nature to erase him. And now someone knew Caleb had found it. He looked over at Axel, curled on the rug but alert, eyes still on the window. "We need to move faster," Caleb said under his breath. Axel didn't bark, he didn't growl, but he didn't look away. The deeper Caleb hiked into the uncharted section of the forest, the more the air thickened with a strange stillness. The hand-drawn map from Stephen Walsh's wallet trembled slightly in his grip, more from adrenaline than wind. Axel padded ahead, tail low and alert, as if he too sensed this was no ordinary part of the woods. The trail had long been reclaimed by nature. It was barely a suggestion now, a worn dip in the soil, the ghosts of boot prints buried under years of pine needles. But just past the ridge, tucked behind a curtain of overgrown laurel and brush, the roof of a cabin emerged like a secret whispered too loud. The structure was cleverly disguised, almost invisible unless you knew precisely what you were looking for. Dark wood siding blended with the surrounding trees, windows blacked out from the inside, no mailbox, no worn path to a road. This place wasn't forgotten. It had been hidden. Caleb crouched beside Axel and studied the cabin from a safe distance. No movement, no smoke, but Axel was tense again. Ears sharp, chest rising slowly, eyes locked on the porch like he expected it to open any second. They circled once, keeping low, then crept in from the blind side. Caleb gently pressed the creaky door open with the butt of his shovel, ready to step back at the first sign of resistance. But the door opened too easily. Inside, dust coated the floorboards, but not evenly. There were sections cleared in straight, human-width patterns. Someone had moved through here recently, someone who knew how to move quietly. Caleb stepped inside and scanned the interior. The place smelled of mildew and old oil. He spotted frayed tent material stuffed in a corner, several empty water canisters, a cracked lantern. And under a loose floorboard, he found a plastic storage bin that made his breath hitch. He opened it slowly. Inside, old maps, spent shell casings, small containers labeled PETN and Detacord, both military-grade explosives. One map had a red line tracing directly over the area where Stephen Walsh had last surveyed. Someone had planned to blow something up out here. And maybe they still were. In the far corner, near the broken window, he saw an old generator, a Honda, rusted on one side, but still functional. It had been used recently. There were faint footprints in the dirt nearby. Not just one set, at least 2 different boot sizes. This hadn't been a one-man operation. Then Axel growled. Not a warning this time. A threat. Caleb's heart slammed into his ribs. He darted to the nearest window and peeked out through a gap in the planks. A cloud of dust curled up the old fire road. Then the engine rumbled. A dark grey pickup truck rolled to a stop just beyond the cabin, tires crunching over gravel that hadn't been driven on in years. Caleb dropped low and grabbed Axel's collar. The dog pressed against his leg, growling but not barking yet. Trained control. But his tension was all Caleb needed to know. 2 men stepped out of the truck. One wore tactical cargo pants and a thick canvas jacket. The other? Caleb felt his throat tighten. It was Ranger Morley, retired. Formerly head of backcountry enforcement. He'd vanished from public view after a quiet internal investigation years ago, one Caleb remembered but had never known the details of. Now here he was, in the middle of nowhere, stepping out of a truck behind a hidden cabin, on land not listed in any modern survey. Caleb backed away from the window and crouched behind the old stove. Axel pressed in tighter. Caleb whispered, "Quiet," barely audible, and Axel almost impossibly froze completely. Just breathing, watching, waiting. From outside, voices echoed. "I told you we needed to burn it already." "We will. Just needed to make sure nobody found that stash, the guy sniffing around the one with the dog. He's been asking questions." Former Forest Service. If he connects this place to the tree, he won't. No way he finds this spot. Even I forgot where it was until last week. I'm telling you, we should have handled it years ago. I did. We just buried the wrong thing. A beat of silence. Then the man added, "We make sure it's the right one this time." Caleb's lungs felt like they were lined with ice. He took out his phone. No signal. Not a bar. He snapped photos blindly out the crack in the window. License plate, faces, the explosives map. Suddenly, Axel's ears twitched again. Caleb caught it too. Footsteps. Fast, coming around back. They were checking the perimeter. Axel's eyes locked onto Caleb's. No sound. Just one intense look. Then the back door creaked. Caleb grabbed Axel's harness and rolled under the sink, into a crawl space so tight even breathing felt like a risk. The back door opened. A pair of boots stepped inside. Long pause. Then a voice muttered, "Wasn't like this last time." A scraping sound. They were moving something. Caleb clutched Axel close. The dog didn't make a sound. Didn't growl. Didn't whine. Just watched, still as a statue, poised to act if Caleb gave the word. Finally the boots turned. Door shut. Silence. Minutes passed like hours. When it felt safe, Caleb emerged slowly, pulling Axel out behind him. The truck was gone. But not for long. Whatever they were protecting out here, it wasn't done. And now, Caleb was the only one who'd seen both the past and the men trying to erase it. Caleb had barely made it back to the tree line behind the cabin before the truck returned. This time, they didn't go inside. They stayed near the front, speaking in low, clipped voices. Caleb, crouched behind a thick trunk of pine, held Axel close by the harness. The dog stayed low, barely breathing, ears pivoting toward every rustle of fabric or jingle of keys from the men only yards away. He activated his phone's voice recorder, not ideal from this distance, but it was all he had. Then he heard it. "Someone's been poking around that old pine," one of them said. "Found prints near the ridge last week." The other man exhaled hard through his nose. "I told you burying that gear so close to the survey line was a mistake. That tree was marked back in '88, and you remember who was with us that day." "I remember," came the reply. "And I remember how we cleaned it up. Walsh just didn't stay buried." There was silence for a beat. Then, "We should have taken him deeper in." Caleb felt his jaw clench. So it wasn't just an accident, not a lost hiker. They had taken Stephen somewhere and made sure he didn't come back. He inched around to the side for a better view. As the taller man turned to reach into the truck bed, something glinted under his jacket. Round, metallic. A badge. Old. Worn. The outline unmistakable even from behind. Police. Caleb squinted harder. He recognized that face. Commander Ellis Rowe, former head of the local Mountain Rescue Division, retired under controversy after a failed search operation in the late '80s that had left a scar on the region's history. Caleb had read the reports years ago, but they were vague. No mention of Stephen Walsh. Just an unconfirmed disappearance under hazardous terrain. Now it made sickening sense. Rowe hadn't failed that mission. He'd buried it. Caleb tapped a quick note into his phone, fingers trembling. Axel stiffened beside him again. Low growl barely audible. Caleb instinctively stopped typing. Rowe's voice again. "If that guy with the dog keeps sniffing around, we'll make it look like a hiking mishap. Same way we did the others. You remember the ledge?" The other man grunted. "2 bodies is bad enough. A 3rd will bring attention." Rowe laughed under his breath. "Not if no one finds him." Caleb's blood turned cold. He'd come up here chasing a ghost. But now, the ghost had a name, a badge, and a clean record built on death. The 2 men loaded something from the cabin into the truck. A long black duffel, heavy, clinking faintly like tools or weapons inside. Then Rowe said something that chilled Caleb more than anything else that day. "The tree is bleeding." "What?" "Groundwater's pulling up trace." "That mineral's moving. If the state surveys it again, we're screwed. We need to dig faster and deeper." That was it. Caleb understood now. It wasn't just about a body. It was about what the body had found. Stephen had stumbled on something valuable. Something buried under that tree. Rare earths, gold, explosives, whatever it was enough to kill for. Enough to keep killing for. The truck started. The engine coughed, then settled into a growl. Caleb and Axel backed into the thicket, careful not to snap a twig. Axel watched the vehicle vanish down the path, then looked up at Caleb like he was asking, "What now?" Caleb's hands were sweating. His head pounded, but his focus was razor sharp. This wasn't just about justice anymore, it was about exposure. He knelt beside Axel. "We're in it now, boy." No turning back. Axel didn't move, just stared straight ahead, locked in, as if he already knew, as if he'd always known. The dog had been there the day Stephen's body was exhumed. He had smelled the decay of injustice. And now, the scent was leading them deeper. Caleb glanced back toward the cabin one last time, then down at the map Stephen had marked all those years ago. There were more red dots, more survey pins, maybe more graves. He folded it carefully, slid it into his pack, and stood. Axel moved beside him. Step for step, his body brushing against Caleb's leg like a silent pact. no more secrets, no more hiding. The badge meant nothing now. Only the truth mattered. The moon sat high and white above the pines, casting long silver bars through the broken windows of the old cabin. Caleb crouched low behind the back wall, breath measured, eyes on the warped doorframe. His fingers tightened around the cold grip of the handheld camera, the one already recording. Beside him, Axel didn't flinch, not even a twitch. His breath was silent, his gaze sharp. Inside, a muffled voice let out a strained groan. Caleb edged forward and peeked through a crack in the wall. His pulse jumped. A man mid-60s, face bruised, lips cracked, was tied to a wooden chair with frayed climbing rope. His arms were cinched behind the backrest, and duct tape still clung to his wrist, as if whoever tied him up had run out mid-job. Eddie. The name had come up in old ranger notes. Edwin Eddie Graves, former fire watch captain. Retired early after filing one too many reports that vanished. Caleb hadn't expected to find him here, not like this. One of the men from earlier, Caleb couldn't see which paced in the cabin, boots scuffing against the warped floorboards. A rifle leaned against the far wall. A black duffel lay open beside it. Shovel, zip ties, a tarp. They weren't going to let Eddie leave this forest. Axel's ears flicked. A car door slammed in the distance. Reinforcements. Time had just run out. Caleb touched the base of Axel's neck and whispered so low he barely heard himself. "Ready?" Axel didn't move. He didn't need to. They went in together. The side window was still cracked. Caleb pushed it gently and slipped inside like smoke. Axel followed silently through the narrow gap, paws landing soundlessly. The man inside turned just in time to see Axel's eyes before the dog lunged. A flash of black and tan fur, a crash, a scream. Axel hit center mass, knocking the man flat on his back, his rifle skidding across the floor. Caleb was on him in a heartbeat, knee pressing down, arm twisted behind his back. The man thrashed under him, but it was useless. He wasn't ready for this. Caleb wasn't just a former soldier. He was a survivor who'd run out of fear years ago. Axel held firm, teeth bared, just inches from the man's throat, but never biting. Just close enough to remind him how quickly things could end. "Eddie," Caleb called. A groggy voice came from the chair. "I'm here, still breathing." Caleb ripped a blade from his boot and cut through the ropes fast. Eddie slumped forward, wrists raw and eyes dazed, but he managed to sit upright. "You Caleb Whitley?" Eddie rasped. "Yeah. They're mining under the tree," Eddie said. "Stephen tried to stop it. I tried to tell someone. They shut us both up. He didn't just fall, son. They pushed him. Caleb didn't flinch." "I know." From his vest pocket, Caleb pulled out the small body cam. Already recording. Already catching everything. He shifted closer to the restrained man on the ground, who was now sweating hard under Axel's breath. "Talk," Caleb said. The man looked from Caleb to the camera, then to Axel. His voice cracked. It was Rowe's call. He said Walsh saw the pit, saw the ore, said he'd ruin everything. We didn't mean to. Not at first. But once the kid was dead, there was no turning back. And Eddie? He knew. Always did. But Rowe kept tabs on him, bribed some, threatened more, said if anything leaked, Eddie would be next. Eddie didn't speak. He just stared. His jaw was tight. He wasn't crying. He was past tears. Caleb hit stop on the camera and shoved it in his jacket. Then headlights pierced through the window. Another truck, pulling up fast. Rowe. Caleb reached for the rifle, checked the mag, clicked the safety off. "Get behind the table," he told Eddie. "If I go down, run east. There's a narrow break in the ridge that leads straight to the highway. What about you?" Eddie asked. Axel growled low. Caleb gave a crooked smile. "I've got backup." The front door slammed open. Rowe stepped in, gun drawn, confident, until he saw Axel. Axel let out one bark deep, sharp, final. Rowe froze. "I should have buried that damn dog with Stephen," he muttered. Caleb raised his rifle. Too late. There was no gunfire. Rowe stared at Caleb for a long second, then dropped his weapon with a clatter. Eddie stepped forward. Rowe blinked. You? You tried to bury me too," Eddie said. "Guess that didn't work either." Outside, the sirens finally began to rise. Caleb had texted the GPS coordinates an hour ago. It was over. Not clean, not peaceful, but over. Axel stood at the center of the room, between Caleb, Eddie, and a man who had once held power over all of them. He didn't bark for show. He barked for the truth. And tonight, the forest listened. The cabin was quiet now, the kind of quiet that settles after a storm, when the adrenaline fades but the consequences remain. Caleb sat on the edge of a splintered workbench, watching Eddie sip from a dented thermos. The room still smelled of old wood, rope fibers, and something deeper like regret soaked into the floorboards. Axel lay near the door, ears tilted slightly forward. Not sleeping, not relaxing, just watching. Always watching. The chaos from earlier had subsided, but the damage lingered. Rowe was zip-tied to a beam outside, surrounded by federal officers who'd arrived not long after the call went out. It hadn't taken long. Apparently, when you say, "I have a full confession and evidence of a decades-long cover-up," people move fast. Inside the cabin, under a pile of old Ranger gear and sealed ammo cans, Caleb found it. An old Nikon F3. Dusty. Heavy. Film still inside. He turned it over in his hands. The leather casing cracked at the edges, the rewind crank stiff. But the roll hadn't been exposed. Not yet. Eddie leaned closer. "That's Stephen's." "You sure? I bought him the strap for his birthday," Eddie said, tapping the faded black leather. "He wore it everywhere." Even when we told him not to bring it on site, Caleb set the camera gently into his pack. "Let's find out what he died for." The film lab in Bozeman was small, quiet, and tucked between a pawn shop and a bakery that smelled like warm cinnamon rolls. The technician looked confused when Caleb handed over the roll. "You sure it's still good?" "It's got to be 30 years old. Just try." 3 hours later, the call came in. "You might want to come see this in person," the tech said, voice low. Back in the lab's darkroom, a red light glowed overhead. Sheets of photo paper hung like laundry, and on them, black and white ghosts of a truth long buried. The first few photos were landscape shots, ridges, trees, the kind of thing a surveyor might use to log terrain. Then came close-ups, tracks in the soil, broken roots, a crushed compass. And then, 3 men, standing beside a makeshift mine entrance, half hidden behind brush. One of them had his back to the camera, lifting a crate of what looked like core samples. Another wore a ranger's uniform. Not standard issue. The third man was unmistakable. Rowe. Younger. Same hawk-like profile. Same self-importance in the way he stood. He wasn't just aware of the mine, he was managing it. Another photo. A crude map drawn into the dirt with a stick. Beside it, a notebook. A gloved hand in the frame, likely Stevens holding a flashlight over it. Then the final photo. Stevens' camera had been angled upward, likely from the ground. The image was blurry, grainy. But there, looming in the upper left corner, was a boot. Someone had been standing over him. The timestamp on the photo matched the estimated time of Stevens' disappearance. Eddie sat beside Caleb, jaw clenched. He knew. He knew they'd come for him. Caleb didn't reply. He was staring at the boot. The tread matched the ones Rowe had worn during his arrest. Outside, rain began to tap against the window. The next day, the photos were in the hands of the FBI. They moved fast. Within 24 hours, a task force had been greenlit. Multiple former and current forest officers were placed under investigation. Caleb wasn't told how high it went, but from the silence that followed, he figured it reached the topsoil of some very powerful roots. The press release listed it plainly. New photographic evidence has prompted a reclassification of the 1988 death of federal surveyor Stephen Walsh. Formerly ruled an accident, the case is now being investigated as a homicide connected to a larger illegal mineral extraction operation, potentially involving public officials. Eddie read the bulletin and looked out at the tree line. Took them 36 years. All Stephen wanted was to tell the truth. Axel let out a low chuff and rested his head on Caleb's boot. Caleb scratched the dog's ear. He still did. Caleb said. Later that evening, they burned what was left of the old maps and journals in the cabin's rusted stove. Not to hide the past, but to put it to rest. Caleb kept one thing, the last photo, the one with the boot. He pinned it on the inside of his Airstream, right above Axel's bed. A reminder, not all justice comes from courtrooms. Sometimes it grows beneath trees, carried by silence, dug up by claws, and sealed with the click of a camera shutter no one expected to still be alive. Not even time could bury the truth. And as Axel lay curled in the shadows that night, chest rising slow and steady, Caleb whispered, "Good work, partner." Axel didn't bark. He didn't need to. 6 months later, the forest was quieter. Not empty, just quieter. The cabin was gone, torn down plank by plank under a federal order. What remained was a clearing that didn't forget. The old tree still stood, its core now hollowed out. But the rot had been scraped clean. Caleb had done it himself, not because anyone asked him to, but because the past deserved to breathe again without secrets buried in sap and silence. He sat with Axel beneath that tree now. The summer sun filtered through the leaves, dappled gold across Axel's black and tan coat. The dog lay with his head on Caleb's boot, eyes half closed, tail twitching at the sound of wind. They didn't speak. They didn't need to. Justice had come in pieces. Rowe had been indicted first racketeering, manslaughter, obstruction of justice. 3 others followed, all linked to the illegal mining ring that had quietly siphoned minerals from protected land for decades. The charges were dense, the trials long. But the evidence was undeniable. The photographs, the confession, the testimony from a ranger who finally chose truth over silence. Eddie had retired quietly. No press conferences, no medals, just a quiet departure from a service he once loved before it betrayed him. Caleb, too, disappeared from the headlines. He'd refused interviews, declined awards. He didn't want to become a symbol. He just wanted to make sure Stephen was remembered for something other than a cautionary tale. So he built a marker. Just him and a chisel, and a flat piece of stone he'd hauled up from the riverbed. It wasn't flashy, just solid, honest. He set it at the base of the old tree, where the roots still curled around memory like fists. The engraving was simple. He didn't bark for glory. He barked for the truth. He ran his hand along the stone, then looked down at Axel. "Come here, boy." Axel stood and pressed his head into Caleb's chest, letting out a low exhale that felt like closure. Caleb smiled, fingers tangled in the thick fur behind Axel's ears. "You did good, partner." A gust of wind stirred the leaves overhead. The sound was like whispers, not haunting, just present, as if the forest finally could breathe again. They sat there a while longer, a man and his dog. No more missions, no more chase, just peace, and maybe that was enough. Or maybe it was the beginning of something else, because truth doesn't stay buried forever. It has a way of clawing its way back to the surface, sometimes with teeth, sometimes with silence, sometimes with a bark. So now we ask you, what's your story with a loyal pet? If this story moved you, if Axel reminded you of your own companion, whether furry, feathered, or four-legged, consider supporting our channel. Subscribe to German Shepherd for more true-to-heart stories, because every bark tells a story, and every loyal soul deserves to be heard.